Welcome to Chock's Hangar. I'm sure you recognise that. The door's 5 to 1. And the reason for that is because today we are looking at P3D version 5. The shiny new version of P3D from Lockheed Martin, which they released on the 14th of this month, so it's brand new. So we're going to be checking out what's good, what's bad, what's changed in it from previous versions, what kind of performance you can expect from the thing, and all that sort of stuff. So hang on to your hat, whether or not you've got a silly airline pilot hat like I've got or not. We'll check it out. You ready? Let's go.
Whenever a new ESP-based sim comes out, reports vary. Some people love it, some people hate it. We'll get into why that's so when we look at P3D version 5 in a little bit more detail in a moment. But before we do that, to understand why I think P3D version 5 is a significant development on the timeline of ESP-based sims, we need to look at how that development has progressed. So let's do that just very briefly. So, 2006, Microsoft released the last version of Flight Simulator that they were to produce, FSX. Still bound to the CPU, so unable to use modern hardware to its best advantage, and still a 32-bit application. It was kind of old before its time, and unfortunately Microsoft at that time were consolidating their business interests, weren't prepared to throw the kind of money necessary at the development of Flight Simulator to take it into an era where it'd be able to use modern hardware. So in 2009, rather unsurprisingly, they announced the closure of the AC studio that developed Flight Simulator, much to the dismay of many Flight Simulator fans, including me. They did briefly return to the fray in 2012 with the release of Microsoft Flight, but it was a lackluster effort from them, and they abandoned it pretty much right after they released the thing. However, in 2007, Flight Sim fans were thrown a bit of a lifeline when Lockheed Martin announced that they'd acquired a license to use the Enterprise Sim platform, ESP, to develop their own Flight Sim, which they did. First version of that came out in 2010, second version came out in 2013, third version came out in 2015. All three versions, first one, second one, and third one, 32-bit applications, so not getting around that that memory limitation issue, and also somewhat CPU bound, so not much better in terms of performance than the original FSX. However, they do differ in having VR capability and also bathymetry simulation, so that they can simulate subsurface and surface operations in literal waters, so genuine mission simulators, which is where Lockheed Martin's interest stems in it. But it wasn't until 2017 when Lockheed Martin brought out P3D version 4, a 64-bit version, that I think they had a version that significantly improved on FSX. Still somewhat CPU bound, but improvement performance-wise, and certainly not suffering from those out-of-memory issues. Now, at the same time that Lockheed Martin were doing all that, in 2014, Dovetail announced that they too had an ESP license, and they developed FSX SE, the Steam edition. It combines all of the mission disks and patches that were available for the original box and download versions of FSX from Microsoft, and they recompiled it as well so that its performance would be a little bit better. It's the current version that you can buy on Steam. It's the best version of FSX you can get, but it is still a 32-bit application, so it's still susceptible to out-of-memory issues, and it is still CPU bound in large part. So in 2017, like Lockheed Martin, Dovetail decided they wanted a bit of that 64-bit action, so they began developing Flight Sim World, 64-bit based on the ESP platform. Now, it never made it out of beta. You could buy an early access version of it, and it showed some promise, but it never really got the Flight Simulator community's support behind it, which I personally thought it was a bit of a shame. But it did nevertheless show us the way things were going to go, because it included Simul's True Sky atmospheric simulation, which you find in P3D version 5. So we'll see that in some more detail in a moment or two. Which is kind of interesting. So that means that from FSX up to the current version of P3D, there have in fact been 8 ESP-based flight simulator attempts, with version 5 P3D being the current one. So let's look at that now. So the first thing that you notice when you look at P3D version 5 is that it's got a new splash screen, but we don't really care about that. What we care about is what features it's got. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of the features that are in the new version of P3D, and I'll explain what the hell all those things are, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the actual program itself and how it performs.
Get your people back and head down. This is going to be a big one.
It is indeed going to be a big one, so pay attention, because the first two features on this list, the more you know about them, and I'm going to talk about that right now, the more you want to know about them and the better you understand them, the better idea you'll have of whether your computer is going to run P3D V5 well, and not only that, whether it's going to run the forthcoming Microsoft flight simulator that's being developed by Asobo Studios in France, and also any fancy computer games that have high-end graphics. You'll have a better idea of whether it's going to run those as well. It says, right up at the top of this list, it says, enhanced performance and graphical capabilities enabled by the new Microsoft DirectX 12 rendering engine. Now, first up, that's a bit misleading. It says the new Microsoft DirectX 12 rendering engine. It would probably be more accurate to say the current DirectX 12 rendering engine, because DirectX 12 has been around since 2014. It was launched with Windows 10. If you've been using computer games for a number of years, you'll probably be familiar with DirectX. Over the years, you might have installed computer games, and when they were installing, it said, oh, your computer needs DirectX 9 or DirectX 10 or what have you, and you've hit the OK on the window that's popped up, and it's installed it, and you've thought, right, fair enough, but probably not paid much attention to what DirectX actually is. So let's find out what that is. Let's talk about that so that you understand it. Now, DirectX is the umbrella name for a collection of APIs. Now, APIs are application programming interfaces, i.e. they are the tools that software programmers use in order to communicate with the hardware of the device that they are writing the software to operate on. In other words, DirectX 12 or DirectX, the previous versions, is the tool used to communicate with the graphics processing unit and the CPU. And DirectX 12 is the one that's capable of talking to the latest GPUs, the fancy graphics cards. That previously has been the problem with ESP based flight simulators like FSX and preceding versions of P3D. You might have had a fancy graphics card in your computer, but the programmers of your flight simulator were not using DirectX 12, so they weren't using tools that were fully capable of talking to your graphics card and utilizing all of the fancy stuff that it was capable of displaying visually. So they didn't bother putting any fancy graphics stuff in the flight simulator because there was no point, because there was no way to talk to the hardware that would be able to reproduce those things. So that's why flight simulators have traditionally looked a bit crap and lagged behind. You know, if you've played Skyrim or Black Desert Online or things like that, they look way better than typical flight simulators, and that's been the reason. The software couldn't talk to the hardware. Now, DirectX, it's a collection of APIs that can talk to your hardware, and it covers things such as the 3D rendering, the 2D rendering, how the music plays back, how the audio plays back, etc., and how all those things are controlled. There are other things that DirectX 12 can do. For example, DirectX 12 can access ray tracing capabilities of your graphics card, if it can do all that kind of stuff. Ray tracing itself is not part of DirectX exactly. What it is it's an extension that DirectX 12 can work with, but because it can, what we might see sort of funky atmospheric effects using ray tracing in real time and stuff like that. What we certainly will see is a lot better 3D effects. So stand by in P3D version 5 to see add-ons that are developed for it, say add-on aeroplanes that can do things like have convincing heat blur coming off the engines and exhaust plumes coming off them, or they can have convincing icing appearing on your airframe or on the windscreen of your cockpit. You're going to see all that sort of stuff appearing because your graphics cards have been capable of doing that for years, but your flight simulator wasn't telling the graphics card to do that sort of thing. So this is why DirectX 12 is kind of cool. Now, So that all sounds great, but the important thing is you need to have a graphics card that is capable of supporting this. Some CPUs can support it as well, so we're going to talk about that. Now, you heard me say that DirectX 12 has been around since 2014, so you can pretty much use that year as a guide as to whether your graphics card in your computer will support DirectX 12. However, the manufacturers of graphics cards, AMD and Nvidia typically, usually want to be ahead of the curve. Since about 2012, a couple of years before DirectX 12 was launched, both Nvidia and AMD were producing some graphics cards that could support DirectX 12 because it had all the necessary information ahead of time out of Microsoft. So it is possible to have a graphics card from around about 2012 that may support DirectX 12. There is much more of a chance that it will support it if it dates from 2014 onwards. But obviously what you need to do is you need to find out the model of your graphics card and you need to look up its specs and see if it supports DirectX 12, because then you will know that your graphics card can use all of the stuff that P3D is telling your computer to do. Now, the other thing to bear in mind with your graphics card is what I've seen in messing around with P3D version 5 in the past week or so is that it uses, typically I've seen about between 5 and 5.9 gigs of memory of my graphics card. Now that's kind of like below 6 gigabytes, but only just below 6 gigabytes. Now fortunately that my graphics card has 8 gigabytes of video memory on it, so I'm well clear of the upper limit there. But it's something to bear in mind. If your graphics card only has 6 gigabytes of memory on it, you're getting pretty close to the ragged edge, and it might be a little bit iffy. If you've got a graphics card that's got 12 gigabytes of video memory on it, then you're absolutely laughing. You know, some have got 10, not very many. They tend to go up in multiples of 4. You'd be okay with that. I've been okay with 8 gigabytes on mine, but it's one of those things to bear in mind. Now, a similar thing is worth noting for your CPU, because there are CPUs that can make use of DirectX's capabilities as well. Now, excuse me. So, a basic guide to that. If you have an Intel processor in your computer and it is a model that is either a Haswell model processor or anything after that, there is a very good chance that it will support all of the functions of DirectX 12. If you have an AMD processor in your computer, and we're talking about CPUs here, and your AMD CPU is a GCN model, that's a Graphic Core Next model, there is a good chance that it will support all the DirectX 12 functions as well. So you're going to be better off with one of those models. So if you look up what model of CPU you've got and what model of GPU you've got, how much RAM they've got, and whether they support DirectX 12, then you'll have a good idea of how your computer is going to run with P3D version 5, but also probably how it's going to run with the new Microsoft simulator that Asobo are developing and any other fancy games and stuff like that. So that's what DirectX 12 is all about, and that's why it's exciting, because it's going to make your simulator look better, and it means that your simulator is now accessing all that stuff and using it. Now, the second thing on that list is realistic sky, clouds and atmosphere with Simul's True Sky integration. Now, Simul is a company that's just up the road from me. It's about 35 miles up the road in Liverpool, on the fancy dock part. Now, to use Simul's own blurb, True Sky is a real-time weather and atmospheric solution for software developers. typically games manufacturers. Now, what it will do is it will simulate an entire atmosphere over a massive area that can change in real time, so it can generate things like snow, rain, rainbows, mirages, all kinds of cool stuff like that. And it's constantly being developed, and it's been used in a lot of fancy games, a lot of PlayStation stuff and Xbox stuff and what have you. Incidentally, PlayStation and Xbox both use DirectX 12 as well. Simular's True Sky, we first saw it in a flight simulator in Dovetail's Stillborn FSW Flight Sim World, and it wasn't very well optimized in that, but if you've seen that, then you've got a pretty good idea of what it looks like. But I'm going to show you it later in this video in P3D version 5, and it is very impressive, and it'll be even more impressive when all of your funky add-on developers for weather engines and stuff like that create some add-ons that can access all of that True Sky stuff in your simulator and generate real-time, realistic weather over hundreds of miles that's changing and looking realistic and using realistic lighting and ray tracing and all that kind of stuff. So, good things ahead for P3D version 5 and lots of them. So, the third thing on the list is Dynamic Ocean with NVIDIA WaveWorks 2.0. Now, what the hell is WaveWorks 2.0? And importantly, if it's NVIDIA, will it work on AMD stuff? So let's talk about that. Now, NVIDIA developed a set of tools, a bit like the DirectX APIs that game developers can use to access capabilities on NVIDIA graphics cards to display certain effects, and they all come under the banner of GameWorks, and under the banner of GameWorks is WaveWorks for ocean effects. So it will work on NVIDIA GPUs that support that. It can use the CPU processing as well, but it won't by default be on AMD GPUs. Now, whether AMD develop an equivalent to that is a bit up in the air at the minute. The NVIDIA don't exactly stop other companies from using it, but they're not really likely to want AMD to be using that and having their GPUs have the same capabilities. So the upshot of all that is that if you want really funky looking oceans on your flight simulator and you're going to get P3D that supports that WaveWorks, you're going to want an NVIDIA GPU rather than an AMD one. I've got an AMD GPU, so tough luck for me, but then again, I'm not particularly bothered about the oceans looking super realistic. But you know, if it's one of those things that bothers you, NVIDIA GPU. Next on the list, added slope runway support, including AI takeoff and landing capabilities. Pretty much self-explanatory, although it doesn't mean that all the runways in P3D version 5 are sloped. It means that the program is capable of supporting them. There are a few in there at the moment that have slopes on them, Luckler, Courchevel. You can add them yourself, you can mess around with it if you want to, but it's more about it supporting it than it actually having loads of them. Next on the list, updated time zones to match real world boundaries. That was a fix that was added to some versions of Flight Simulator, but now it's in there. Next one, added 8.33 kilohertz spacing support. The latest sort of ATC radio channel support is in there now, so there is a little bit of ATC tweaking, but nothing major. Now, next one down, users can now switch vehicles while in multiplayer if enabled by the host. Pretty self-explanatory. Updated multiplayer user interface to streamline multiplayer setup and lobby interactions. Pretty self-explanatory. Multiplayer host and clients can now choose any starting location. Just what it says on the tin. Multiplayer lobby is now available in session. The map screen is now available during flight. Now that is useful. You go to the map and your sim doesn't pause. You can mess around with it and hit OK. Added TAC on course selection and tracking support. Pretty self-explanatory. Compiler and SDK updated to Visual Studio 2019 and .NET 4.8, so stuff for developers there. Updated default mouse and joystick camera controls. They've tweaked them a bit. We'll see that when we have a look at the program itself. Updated default controller layout. Again, we'll see that when we have a look. Added controllable flashlight to virtual cockpit views. You've seen some developers do that. It's built into P3D V5 now. Updated user interface design, we'll see that when we have a look at it. Added brownout and whiteout effects support for helicopters. Whiteout, sector whiteout's kind of an important thing for helicopter pilots where they lose the visual horizon, so it's kind of cool if you want to put that in there if you're a developer. Updated over 24,000 airports with new data across the entire globe, so they've updated them a bit so that we're not looking at stuff that was back in from 2006. Updated global terrain, elevation, water, shoreline data and traffic routes. We'll see that again when we have a look. GPS data can now be broadcast to a specific IP address. Ground contact reaction is now done per contact point, so better landing physics. Added a prompt to warn if GPU memory has run out, with the option to revert graphics settings. That'll prevent a crash if your GPU is running out of steam. You can kind of tone it down rather than the program locking up, so it's kind of nice that. Weather themes can now be customized in the weather UI. Again, we'll see that. Added surface perturbations to 2D water. More of that with that NVIDIA WaveWorks than there is on an AMD GPU, but it's there. Added support for the Varjo XR1 mixed reality headset. Added SIDS and stars visualization support for gauges. So you're going to see stars being added to things like the Reality XP and stuff like that. New and updated default content. Updated Randolph AFB. Added Lockheed Martin civilian utility aircraft engine aircraft. Added Lockheed Martin turboprop trainer aircraft. Added the F-35B and F-35C variants with PBR textures developed by India Fox Echo. So don't buy that from Sim Market or whatever because it's already in there. Updated F-35A model with PBR textures developed by India Fox Echo. Updated F-22 model developed by Iris Simulations. Updated C-130 to support 8.33 kilohertz spacing on its radios, so the more modern format for radios. Updated runway surface textures to 4K PBR textures. You can see that, and you will see that when we have a look at it. The runways look a lot better. Updated various airport and land class textures. Again, we'll see that when we have a look at it. Looks much better. Updated various road, railroad, stream, shoreline, and wake textures. They have. Again, we'll see that because I'm gonna do a flight from Liverpool Airport near the coast, so we can see all that. Fixed mismatched building textures, added several additional speed tree types and seasonal variants. They look much better. Added a sample race scenario showcasing racing scenario capabilities, so developers can do that. More on that in a minute. Added additional road traffic models. They've also updated some of the vehicles on the airport. They look a little bit better and a little bit more fitting because some of the trucks were a bit cack at the airport, but they look a lot better now. Fixed incorrect light mattings in the mall aircraft. Pretty much does what it says on the tin. That updated deep sea submarine model. There you go, pretty self-explanatory. Updated several models to reduce flickering issues at large distances. But of course, what you can do is you can turn up your anisotropic filtering as well, and that'll probably do the same thing. Updated taxiway signs to use PBR textures, so flashy-looking taxiway signs. Improved jetway models and textures. Yes, they have. Fixed several parts in the F-16A model that were missing PBR textures. Pretty self-explanatory. Added a multitude of new landmark buildings spanning the globe. They have. So, mainly in major cities, but, there's a few more interesting things on there and newer stuff that went up after 2006. Sloped various airports across the globe. They have. Added multiple wildlife models. Updated the ATC tower interior. You might not like that. The sort of ceiling can get in the way, but there is an option for you to use the older one, so you don't have to have it if you don't want to. Updated various effect values. Yes, they have. Now, fixes and improvements. Improved virtual reality performance. Well, I don't use VR, so I'll take their word for it. Adjusted auto-generated building height, improved vehicle list caching, speeding up vehicle selection and multiplayer loading. We'll see that in a minute or two. Added keyboard shortcuts for opening settings on UI screens. Again, we'll see that. Control bindings can now be searched by key name in the controls user interface. So there are a lot of changes to the UI. Added an on-off key set events for several light controls that previously only had toggle commands. So more capability in the sim for developers. Fixed an issue where GPS ILS markers would be misaligned in some cases, so tweaks to the airports. A default scenario name is now generated when opening the save scenario screen. Now that is a great feature. I use that a lot. You don't have to bother typing in a name for saving your scenario. It takes a good guess at it. Scenery library items can now be dragged to different locations. Yes, they can. Vehicles can now be grouped by category in the vehicle select screen. We'll see that when we have a look at the user interface. Fixed various issues issues in the pilot record's user interface, including page flips, distorted images, and only displaying .bitmap screenshots. So, you know, if they use the pilot records, they display a lot better now. Launching Sim Director is now available from the startup screen. I'll talk a little bit about Sim Director when we get in the sim. If you're not familiar with it, you will be by the time you watch this video. Fixed issue with corrupted exe XML file that will prevent other add-on exe files from opening. Fixed UI sizing issues seen on lower resolution displays. Sound is now enabled by default in slew mode. I use slew quite a bit for my video reviews, but I don't really care about the sound being in there, but it's in there. Yeah, says you can disable it anyway. Added additional helicopter autopilot tuning capabilities. So if you're a developer and you want to put autopilots on your choppers, there's more capabilities with it. Entities now smoothly transition to level flight after finishing playback in a recording. Nice if you use the playback. Infogen text now displays when voice comms are active. That's cool. It means that you get the text message as well as the sound. Fixed environmental forces for turboprops, so turboprops are a little bit better now. Change the default control mode to direct input. Nice, bit better control. Updated airport light visibility. That is causing problems with some add-ons that aren't quite P3D version 5 capable, so it'll require a bit of a tweak from some developers. Fixed an issue where cancelling out the failure screen will revert values back to 0. Opening the failure screen no longer pauses the simulation. Time preview and time and season screens are now combined. The time preview is a lot better now. I'll show you that when we get in the sim. Fixed an issue where the startup screen would incorrectly prompt to converted structured scenarios in some cases. Well, I can't say I've come across that, but I'll take their word for it. Fixed visible borderlines in the water between the US and Mexico. I'm sure Donald Trump will be thrilled about that. Save him building that wall, won't it? Fixed height of the Oriental Pearl Tower. Well, I'll take your word for it because I've never heard of it. Fixed issue causing longer bridges to intersect with the water in some cases. Yes, they have. The bridges are improved. We will see that. Fixed issue causing bridge segments to clip into each other in some cases. Again, we'll see that. Fixed cases where hangar buildings were too large in some cases. Well, I'll take your word for it. Updated boat terminals to prevent large boats from docking too close to shorelines. Yes, they have, and we will see that. Fixed various issues with the weather settings not applying as expected over multiple weather stations. So, improved weather, which will be handy with that TrueSky implementation. Fixed an issue where certain weather units would not convert to the correct types with the hybrid metric / imperial setting enabled, so they've solved the problem there. Improved weather interpolation between weather stations. Yes, they have. I've seen that. It's a lot better. Navigation visuals are now available in Sim Director. Again, if you're not familiar with Sim Director, you will be by the time we finish this video. Added unit conversion drop-downs so additional data types in Sim Director. Fixed text alignment with long object names in Sim Director. Preview windows. Added no autogen suppression and no crash flags to the scenery object created in Sim Director. Fixed Sim Director button state sync issue with keyboard time review and navigation visual buttons. If this is all a bit Greek to you, Sim Director will allow you to create missions and scenarios. I'll show it you when we finish looking at all these lists. Fixed issue with the elapsed scenario time not resetting properly when switching modes in Sim Director. Fixed an issue where the Sim Director attachment screen would not update correctly in some cases. Updated the vehicle user interface to group by make and model by default and updated column headers. Now that is interesting and we will see that. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but what it will do is it means it can be easier to find the plane that you're after if you've got a lot of aeroplanes installed in your flight sim, because you can group them by lots of different methods and stuff like that. Improved lens flare logic. Well, you know, I'm sure J.J. Abrams will be thrilled about that one. Reduced instances of freeway traffic disappearing along road segments. Yes, they have. That I've seen a couple of glitches with that, but generally speaking, they have improved it. Improved bridge and overpass handling for freeway traffic. Improved the high dynamic range effect. Fixed an issue causing PBR materials to completely black out in dark conditions. Yeah, I think they have. I think that's probably true from what I've observed. Added additional advanced Varjo headset options. Well, if you've got a Varjo headset, I'm sure you're thrilled about that. Platform height is now correctly handled when changing locations. I'll take your word for it. Actually, no, I don't need to take your word for it. That's true. that. It means that your plane doesn't go bouncing all over the place when you go to a new location. So it is cool that. Improved altitude transitions between large airports and surrounding terrain. Yes, they have. We'll see that when we look at the sim. Fixed an issue where fog could be applied to panel textures. Fixed an issue where cloud altitude will be incorrect after changing locations. So some fixes. Now, fixes and improvements for the Professional Plus version only. As you probably know, there are different versions of P3D that you can buy. We'll talk about that in a little while. The pricing remains the same. So, fixed an issue preventing weapon damage from a plane when played back from a recording in some cases. Additional camera interfaces, interface updates for CIGI. Added additional configuration options, descriptions and validation checks to several AI behaviors in Sim Director. Fixed an issue with entities assigned to combat air patrol behavior losing altitude. The elapsed scenario time now displays in Sim Operator. Navigation visuals are now available in Sim Operator. So if you use all this stuff and you've got the Pro version, I'm sure this will mean something to you. I don't tend to mess around with that very much. Added the measure tools to Sim Operator and fixed an issue causing incorrect combat air patrol altitude handling. Now, if you are a developer or if you like to mess around with stuff, you're probably interested in the SDK for developing stuff, and there are some things in there. Most people at some point end up with the SDK for one reason or another. I occasionally make some scenery, so this is something that I will faff about with, but it won't bother you if you just jump in and fly stuff. So new features. Airports can now be created with sloping runways. Obviously that's a big deal. You might want to mess around with that yourself. It's not that hard to do. Distance remaining signs can now be generated for runways. Updated SDK samples to Visual Studio 2019 and .NET 4.8, so they've updated it a bit. Added enhanced engine extensibility features for sim objects. Yes, they have. Added ability to define always-on mapping for key events defined in Gauge XML trigger events. So, if you like messing around with stuff and developing scenarios, kind of useful. Added a new intensity value in lumens to PBR light effects. So, it's actually measured in the proper light value lumens. Added airport background flatten options to control altitude transition with surrounding terrain. So messing around with stuff and developing stuff is a lot easier. That is worth knowing, because if you start messing around to create a slope runway, all the taxiways attached to it adjust automatically, which is pretty cool. So fixes and improvements. Fixed a bug preventing exclusion rectangles from correctly excluding scenery when using the exclude all object setting. Updated the AutoGen editor user interface, converted several samples to the add-on XML format. Fixed an issue with where some tools would write out generated data to the incorrect location. Fixed naming of axis steering set event. Fixed bug where tail numbers were not being set for helicopters created with the SimConnect blah blah blah. Yeah, if you're into all this stuff, then it'll mean something to you. If not, just you can fast forward until we're past this bit. Fixed traffic toolbox to dump airport list to correctly parse airspace type. Fixed issue where the image tool should not load certain direct draw textures. Added iSim Object Manager unregistered callbacks. Added 55551 texture support for PBR material, so more capability. Fixed an issue that caused 3ds Max to freeze up when it was auto-saving. Yeah, that's kind of cool, because I use 3ds Max and teach it sometimes, so anything that stops it freezing up's got to be good as far as I'm concerned. And last but not least on this list, fixed an ambient in-cloud SimConnect call. So, some stuff for developers, and if you're not into sort of developing and messing around with it, maybe give it a try. You can add a slope to a runway yourself, and it's really not that hard to do, if you have a quick read of the SDK. Anyway, enough of that. Let's have a look at the simulator in action. Okay, so here we are in P3D version 5, and you'll notice that that vehicle there is carefully driving around my aeroplane, which doesn't always work perfectly, but I have noticed in this version that vehicles will stop and try and avoid your aircraft, so that's kind of a nice function. This aircraft, incidentally, is not one of the default ones. This is the Aeroplane Heaven B-17 Flying Fortress F, and the scenery that we've got here is UK 2000's Liverpool John Lennon Airport, and the surrounding scenery is Orbix, England. So we're not on completely default scenery. Now, when we go to the menus, if we have a look here on the first menu, you can see that all of this stuff is the same as pretty much in previous versions. But one of the things that has changed a little bit is the interface. So if I bring up the edit menu, and we have a look at that, you can see that the interface has changed. Now you can see another thing that occurs here, that is glitching a little bit. That's one thing that I have noticed in this version, is that the 3D displays of the aircraft can be a little bit iffy. Sometimes they don't display at all, but then again, you know, it's good enough for you to be able to select what aircraft you're looking at, because you can identify it pretty okay, so I'm not that bothered by it. Now, as far as changing vehicles are concerned, the interface has changed a little bit there. So when we hit change vehicle and we look at that, there is pretty much the default setting of that, and you'll notice that I'm not getting the image of the aeroplane there, so that can be a little bit iffy, I have noticed. But what we can do is, if we hide the details, we can display it like that, and you'll notice that what I am able to do is I'm able to group by different things, so make and model and all this kind of stuff. So if I group by type, for example, then what it will do is it will list light attack bombers, medium bombers, and all this kind of stuff. So lots of different ways that you can display stuff, and slight changes to how you can display the interface, which is a little bit nicer. Now, the other thing that is a little bit different on the interface is when we look on the options menu. So if I have a look at that, we'll see what's what. Now, the interface is slightly cleaner. I think it's a bit nicer looking, but there are some new functions on it. So when we look on the application stuff, all of this stuff is pretty much the same, and all of that stuff's pretty much the same. You'll note that there is a correction to the sort of hybrid systems that was mentioned when we were going through the list, and there is another thing on there which is enable GPS data transmission, and you can send it to a specific IP address. So I can do that and send it to an IP address, and it will let me put in the IP address there. So there's a function that's been added. Now, if we look at the information panel, it's pretty much the same, but note that there was a correction to the information, so that you can have a line of text, but you can also have the audio playing at the same time, which is kind of cool. If you use things like air haul or what have you, that's kind of cool. Sound is pretty much the same. But they have added note enable sound in slew mode. Not that I'm particularly bothered about it, but you can have that if you want to. Traffic menu, pretty much the same. Realism menu, pretty much the same. Add-ons a little bit different, that it's got this thing here, but you know, pretty much the same as the scenery library. But we can click on these things and it'll get us a little bit of information. For example, EDDK Cologne Bonn Airport scenery for Cologne Bonn Airport, publisher Aerosoft or what have you. Real Volmet Europe, no description of what it does. It allows Volmet transmissions on your radio. So there's the add-ons that I've got installed on this. Not a lot of them at the minute. Scenery library, pretty much the same, all the same stuff. You know, add area, move areas up and down, empty on X or empty the cache on exit. Display settings definitely different. When we look at the display settings, this stuff is pretty much the same. However, when we start going to the world and lighting settings, there you will see some of the different functions. So when we go on the world menu there, all of that terrain stuff is pretty much the same, where you can change the resolution of stuff. The scenery complexity is the same. Dynamic 3D autogen vegetation, although note that they have added some additional models to it. Sometimes I have that on because for things like this B-17, if you park it near some trees, the backblast from the propellers will move the trees, and it kind of looks cool for videos and stuff like that. Water and bathymetry, so we've got that kind of thing going on. Special effects is the same. This area down here is definitely different. This is where you can put the true sky stuff on. So cloud draw distance is the same and cloud coverage density is the same. windshield effects, volumetric fog, turbulence and thermal effects on there. But what we can also do, you'll notice the enhanced atmospherics beta at the moment. This is your true sky stuff. So if we put that on, then we've got the option for the little God rays thing on there. And when I hit OK, you'll see that, and you'll see how it changes on the background. But before we do that, let's have a look at the lighting. So the lighting stuff is pretty much the same, nothing too different on that. And then what we've got is we've got key assignments, we've got axis assignments, control calibration, and other controls on there. So a few bits for sort of multi-touch and gesturing and stuff like that, for if you're using touch screens and things like that. So a few bits and pieces. So I've hit OK on there, and notice the lag on the display there, and a bit of sort of weird pixelation going on. Yeah, big deal. So we can get to Sim Director from here, but I'll look at that in a moment or two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit OK on there, and then what we get is a redraw on things, and this is now using the Simul True Sky, so you can see that the lighting changes quite significantly on there. Now, not a lot going on weather-wise, but of course, what I can do if I go into the weather scenario is I can play around with that. So you might like that lighting effect, you might not, but it is a choice that you can select if you want to. So back in the options, if I go to the world settings there and turn that off. If I don't like that, note the backdrop there and what it looks like. If I hit OK, we can be back on a more typical flight simulator appearance. But that True Sky stuff, if we want to use that, if we go up to the weather setting here, and we have a look at that, what we will be able to do is we will be able to add layers of cloud, so you can mess around with the sort of base on the tops and what have you, and it will let you do cirrus, cumulus, stratus, thunderstorm, and then if you make a rain layer, what you can do is you can mess around with the precipitation type, rain and snow, and the rate of it and all that kind of stuff. So there are a number of things that you can mess around with weather-wise if you want to, if you prefer to use that with the atmospherics, and it does look a lot more realistic. I do think that's pretty cool. So anyway, carrying on with a look at the interface. So the vehicle menu, not too different, although the failures menu doesn't pause. That was one of the things that we saw on the features. Navigation menu, pretty much the same. However, they've changed things, like if I go to an airport that's at a different elevation, it won't bounce my aeroplane or what have you. It'll do that kind of thing. If we go to the map does not pause the sim. So that's kind of nice, which is pretty cool. Now, if we go to the world menu, of course, time and season has changed a little bit, so we can faff around with that a little bit if we want to, and change the preview rate. So slight changes to it, and it tends to load a little bit quicker, that, so I do think that's pretty cool. On the options menu, we've had a look at all that, so simulation rate and positioning and all that kind of stuff, and graphics and add-ons is all the same. The view menu is pretty much the same. The analysis stuff's the same for instant replays and what have you. Go to network, that's pretty much the same, although note that there are some changes in the multiplayer lobby and stuff like that. On the tools menu, Sim Director, we'll have a look at that in a minute. The VR stuff is pretty much the same. You get to your VR settings, there's a help menu there where you can get information, keyboard assignments and what have you, and then of course there's an add-on menu. The add-on menu only appears when you have some add-ons stuck in there, so if you put things like FSUI PC or AccuFeel or GSX or XPOI or what have you, all that kind of stuff, if you put that on, then you're going to get your add-on menus. So Sim Director, if you're not familiar with it, Sim Director is this. Boom. Are you sure you want to leave your current scenario and enter Sim Director? Yes. So Sim Director takes a moment or two to load, so we're kind of looking at a bit of a black screen for a second, but then eventually what it will do is it will pop up. Boom, there you go. So this is Sim Director, and I'm sure you can probably work out from that. I think I mentioned that it is for creating missions and scenarios. So if you ever used anything like Instant Mission Creator or what have you, you'll know how this works. You set up a bunch of parameters where you start, waypoints, tasks, trigger areas that your plane has to fly through, messages that pop up, and all this kind of stuff. And when you've got all that, it becomes a scenario or mission that you can fly in the simulator, and it's as simple as that. I mean, it takes a while to kind of get used to it if you've not used it before. But you know, if you read the help files on it, it's pretty straightforward. There are a lot of tutorials on how to create stuff and what have you. So pretty straightforward, really. Anyway. So here we are at the runway, and I'll just get the thing lined up, and then we'll get the thing in the air. Don't need to worry too much about getting in the middle of the runway. We can straighten it up with the rudder. So close enough for government work. So in we go to the cockpit. Now obviously the engine noise is pretty loud, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the sound off so that you can hear me properly, and we'll just zoom out a little bit, and then we'll get the power on and get this thing in the air. So I want to get the tail up so that I can see where I'm going. There we go. So keep an eye on the airspeed, and make sure we've got plenty of speed before we haul this thing off, because I'm pretty sure it's got a full fuel load on board. And there we go. Bit of up trim probably help matters as well. And there we go. Now I'll switch to the external view, and we can get the sound back on. And just as we come over here, if I get the gear up, I'm going to pause it here. One of the things that was listed in that features was that they'd sorted out the terrain at the edges of airports and stuff like that, and I have noticed that in this version it does a little bit of a better version of blending into the sea. It could be a bit of a mess in earlier versions, but you know, considering that's quite a drop off, doesn't look fantastic, but it looks okay. So that's one of the features of that has been tweaked in P3D version 5. So I'll get the flaps up, and then we'll start flying. Now I've got the water on fairly sort of low settings, and keep in mind that the water can look better if you're using that that NVIDIA feature. But of course I've got an AMD card, so you know, it's probably not going to do it. I could probably get the water looking a little bit better in the options, because I've not got it on particularly high settings, and I've not got all the reflections on, so we can tweak it a little bit. But one of the things that I am going to do is switch the atmospherics on. Now if you look at how it appears now, like that, and then if I pause it, and I'll get a bit of a view distance on there, so we're kind of looking towards Manchester from Liverpool. And if I go to the options menu, and I go to the graphics, and I go to the weather, if I turned on advanced atmospherics, boom, like that, and hit OK, we get that kind of business going on, with a lot more atmosphere and a lot more fade on the horizon. And the lighting looks a little bit more convincing on the aeroplane, and the lighting on the water looks a bit more convincing. And I could start adding clouds and playing around with the lighting and stuff like that. And what you find is that the sunset, when you've got those atmospherics on and you're using that true sky stuff, is a little bit better as well. So if I hit time and season and go on the preview, I can show you that kind of business there. So we get a lot kind of nicer sunsets. If I I sort of swing that kind of thing around and give you a bit of a preview of that. We can get some nice lighting effects. You get some nice dusk effects there and things like that. So it can be a lot nicer with that on than it would otherwise be if I give you a little bit of a look of that without those atmospherics on. So if we go to the world and we turn off that beta version, so we're back on that. Doesn't look terrible, but it looks more like a simulator than real life. It's okay, but you know, in comparison to what we had with the True Sky stuff on, it's not as good. Now, if I go to the time of season to do previews of that, of the nighttime, it's still okay. But it's not quite as nice lighting wise. You can see that looks okay, but obviously the other stuff is a lot better. So very, very nice that we've got that on the graphics. We've got the enhanced atmospherics, and I think if you look at that, you see why that improves things quite a bit. Now I've got it on fairly sort of intense settings there. I could back that off a little bit if I wanted to, so you can have this look a lot more interesting if you want to, but you can see even with the water on not particularly realistic settings, that improves a little bit. And there you go, that's your difference. So that is P3D version 5. There's a lot in it. I think it's got a lot to recommend it. And just before I close, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this. So obviously it helps if you're looking at this review and you saw the opening sequence of the plane landing at night, the details I had on there and what it was running like when I was showing you stuff, and you know how it was taking to load things and what have you. So obviously it helps if you know what computer I am running the thing on. So what I've done is I've loaded up CPU-Z here, so you can look at exactly what computer this review was done on and what was P3D version 5 running on. So you can see there the CPU is an Intel Core i5-7400 Kaby Lake. So that dates from, I think, Kaby Lake processors, so 2016. So support for the stuff that you'd want, considering that that Directx 12 came out in 2014. So Kaby Lake is one of the processors that is geared towards working with Windows 10. And you can see the caches that I've got there. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary there. And then you can see the main board that I've got, which is a Z270. And you can see the sockets and all that kind of stuff, and what it's actually using. And then if we look at the memory, you can see that I've got DDR4 memory, and this is by no means a flying machine. It's only got 12 gigabytes of memory on there, and not a particularly fast speed either, although it is DDR4. And then you can see on there the slots for the memory, but you can see that it is a decent brand, Corsair. Don't buy cheap memory. If you look at the graphics, you can see that what I've got is I've got an AMD Radeon RX 480, which has 8 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, so 8 gigabytes, and it's quite fast memory. So there you go, that is the machine that I'm using there. So it's an Intel Core i5-7400, and it's an RX 480 with 8 gigabytes of memory on it, and not particularly a lot of RAM. DDR4 12 gigabytes, so by no means a flying machine, and it runs P3D version 5 really well. Anyway, hope you like that. I hope you found it helpful. If you've got any comments, stick them down below. If you like this sort of thing, or there's things that you want me to review or look at, stick your comments down below. Like and subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Blah 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 blah. Look out for me on forums such as flightsim.com and avsim. And see you for the next video soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.